Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Sir Ian Cheshire, is one of the UK's most experienced board leaders across retail, real estate, healthcare and public service. He is chair of Land Securities Group, the FTSE 100 Real Estate Investment Trust, chair of Spire Healthcare Group, the UK's largest independent hospital provider, chair of the King Charles III Charitable Fund, chair of the Global Corporate Climate Coalition We Mean Business, and chair of the Institute for Government. His executive career was spent in large, customer-facing businesses, culminating as Group Chief Executive of Kingfisher plc, owner of B&Q, Screwfix, Castorama and Brico Dépôt, where he led major transformation and established a reputation as a pioneer in sustainable retail. As a non-executive, he has chaired Channel 4, Barclays Bank UK, Debenhams, Manhattan Resource Efficiency and Maison du Monde, and served on the boards of BT Group and Whitbread. He was the UK government's lead non-executive director, has chaired multiple climate and environmental task forces, and is a long-standing champion of inclusion and mental health in the workplace. This is the second part of my conversation with Sir Ian Cheshire. In the first episode, we focused on his experience as a CEO, what boards look like from the executive seat, how non-executives can add real value, and how chairs support CEOs through tough decisions. We picked this conversation up as Sir Ian reflects on his transition from executive to non-executive. From there, we go on to discuss activist shareholders, crisis leadership, AI and technological disruption, government boards, and the practical habits that separate high-performing boards from the rest. Can we move on to talk about your non-executive experience? We talked a lot there through your executive and CEO lens. One of the things I love to collect is examples of moments where boards have provided value-add inflection moments. The archetypal one for me was Nick Jenkins, the founder of Moonpig, when he gave this example of one of his board members asking him, why can't we sell these cards for $2.99 instead of $1.99? And he'd always been fixated on $1.99, and it transformed the economics. And it came from a board member who'd built trust, who had credibility with him, but who was able to ask that simple question. As you look across the different boards you've been involved in, are there some moments like that that really stand out for you where you feel the board has improved the outcome for its organisation?
Again, it's probably harder to come up with individual sort of extreme moments, but there are probably two examples I would use, which is the Spire, where I'm the hospital group, which I chair. We were recipient of an unsolicited hostile bid 3 days after I joined the board, which was an interesting experience. And I generally think that the management team, who are mostly not from public listed backgrounds, were in danger of being overwhelmed, if I'm honest, in terms of the process of having a public bid on your hands. Well, initially private because we kept rejecting it, but then it became public in due course. And the ability of the board, particularly with myself and a couple of others who've been in the listed space, to help the business navigate its way through that and ultimately get past it, and the bid failed. But that process was very much about us as a board helping provide air cover and also allowing the exco, the management CEO, to actually run the business, because the danger in those situations is everything just stops and everyone gets transfixed. And I think that's a rather extreme example, but one where having the right board with the right experience materially improve, I think, the outcome. And then I think the thing I've seen probably most recently is the experience here of pivoting the business strategy at Landsec and potentially taking something which could have been a tricky sort of shift of portfolio and focus and really helping think it through with obviously a great CEO and CFO, but helping get the articulation of that right, and particularly for the markets. And I think the discussion at board definitely helped get that to a better place. And you can sort of see it because you go to your first draft of what you looked at and then you look at the finished product. And obviously the board doesn't do most of the heavy lifting in that, but I can see where we impacted.
So for a board member listening to this who hasn't had the experience you've had of dealing with the hostile bid, who's sitting on a board right now, who's facing that situation, one takeaway from them is to keep the executive focused on the business and not let the business drift on. Any other counsel you would offer them?
Yeah, I think particularly if you're in the bid situation, that's the point where your advisor lineup becomes absolutely fundamental. And I've always tried in my CEO role, but now in my chair role, to make sure I've got from day one, or as close to day one as I can, the best possible lineup of advisors, which includes lawyer, broker, PR, and banker, because you don't know when you're going to need them. And if you don't have advisors that you want to go into battle with, it's really difficult to change them in the middle of if something actually does happen. So the quicker you can get to a lineup of core people that you really want to be involved with, and you might do nothing with them for 2 years, but that's sort of the way it might work. Or you might suddenly find yourself in the middle of a situation, but you've got to have the right people around you to go into a bat, because this is a team sport.
You talked a little bit earlier about the impending seismic disruption from technological change. I think board members everywhere are wrestling with that, and AI
Totally
front of mind. Can you bring to life how you're helping your boards prepare for that with some sort of practical examples? Because it feels to me like everyone is running around looking for solutions and struggling.
Yeah, and I find it extraordinary that what feels like sort of nearly 45 years of being on boards, the two biggest changes in my entire life are happening in my last 5 years of my working life, which seems a bit unfair having practiced on all the other stuff. But the combination of the change in the world order, arguably the end of rules-based American-led structures, and the world becoming multipolar is very different. And then AI is quite clearly the biggest thing that you're going to have to grapple with. But there's two things I sort of comment on the AI situation at the moment. Is the actual use cases right now are still relatively limited, but they're beginning to be there. And it's the use case that's relevant to your industry that matters. So I don't think there is a sort of generic AI does all this and everything changes. It's much more about, well, what for your customer, your teams and processes and your system stacks, what can you do that is different and more valuable? And that will be quite different. We've had one classic micro example of AI at Spire Healthcare, the MRI scanners, which are a crucial part of our business model because the diagnostics are there. And actually typically, because they cost 2 million quid a time, you can't exactly chuck them around. And we ended up getting an AI upgrade on the scanners that created 20% more capacity than we had before. And that was just literally a software improvement, which has had big knock-on benefits for us. Now, by contrast, I can't use AI to automate my patient processes at the moment because they're still too manual. So I've got to digitize them, and then I can start creating some value out the back. Whereas for something like Landsec at the moment, we've got a situation where if I can feed, thousands of leases through an AI process, I can genuinely save a lot of time and money. But that application is not relevant to Spire or to BT or to Channel 4 or the other things I've done. So I think it really is the board saying, well, what are the low-hanging fruit in your sector, in your company? And then the second piece is to constantly try and test stuff. Because I think until you actually see something working, you can talk about the theory of AI being able to change everything, but it's actually only when AI meets the organization that any value is created. So you've got to be trying things in a number of different areas, and so have a sort of sandbox where you do stuff as opposed to talk about stuff. And the reason for that, to my mind, is it's changing so fast that if you're talking about stuff, it'll probably be out of date in 6 months, and the rate of performance increases extraordinarily. So having a rolling process of innovation and testing and seeing where you might be able to add value is the only flexible way to learn, because you cannot predict what this is going to look like in 2-3 years' time. You've got to be out there doing it.
So that sounds like a really tangible thing. So for a board member listening, it's asking that question of, are we sandboxing and testing enough as an organization? Where do we see the low-hanging fruit within our existing knowledge base? One of the things that strikes me some organizations are doing better than others is getting a better understanding of the art of the possible by looking at outside practices. as that example of the MRI scanners, how did that come about? Was that something sort of executive led? Was that initiated by a board discussion?
No, I mean, to be fair with that, that was really about supplier relationships and supplier and working with the right supplier, so that you're thinking hard about who are the suppliers that are going to apply AI, because you don't do all this yourself. There's going to be lots of other partners, and having the right supplier base, the right supplier conversation, saying, what can we do? Is there an application? And you don't, as the company, necessarily have to do all the work, but you're expecting your ecosystem of suppliers to be doing it. I think the top line thing that the board can help contribute, which is a generic thing, is curiosity. It's just always asking, what else could we do? What else is there? How might this change? And a willingness to then go back and try stuff. And as why I talk about sandbox. So try it small before you scale it, but trying to think about how things could be different and looking for external examples. So it's, similar industries or other competitors or people in other geographies doing things, and constantly trying to bring that outside perspective in and see what's actually working. And the difficulty with AI is there's an awful lot of polite pixie dust and hype around it, and you have to be very thoughtful about, is that actually going to work?
The other mega shift you talked about in the change in world order, how does that actually impact on you as a non-executive?
Well, I think the big impact's maybe not in the two current chairs I do, but if I think back to certainly when I was at Kingfisher, and I'm sure they're doing it now, my supply chain looked completely different at the end of my sort of tenure from when it was. I mean, way back when being key starter, it was being supplied by wholesalers in the UK and Europe. By the end, we had a direct sourcing operation based mostly in China, but with other options, and had radically changed our ability to source and create a label and product. That was run on a just-in-time, internationally precision-geared supply chain. Now the answer is you have to actually do resilience planning as opposed to sort of just-in-time planning. And you've got to think very hard about the political security of where you're sourcing from, and therefore how much reshoring do you want to do. And it's, I think, the supply chain and then the macro impact in terms of, we've definitely no longer in a world of low interest rates, and we're not going back anytime soon. It's surprising how many businesses thought 0% interest rates would last forever. And that has materially, I think, distorted quite a lot of previous investment decisions and capital allocation. You're now in a world where 4.5% is the sort of gilts rate. You've got to think very much differently about how you allocate and make capital work. And, that's had direct impact with the impact of inflation for the first time again for a long time. It's completely changed the returns in, for example, property development is completely in a different place from where it was 6 years ago. And that's entirely due down to inflation and interest rate shocks. So you've got to, as a board, I think, be saying, actually, when, to use Maynard Keynes, when the facts change, you change your mind. And so as part of our pivot at Landsec was to say, this doesn't make any sense anymore in this environment. And this is not something we've got out and created. We didn't vote for higher interest rates and instability and inflation. But now we've got them, we're going to have to run the business differently. And I think that sense of understand your macro's impact on your business model is absolutely core to what a board should be doing.
Jamie Dimon has talked about that in the context of JP Morgan. One of the first things he came in and did was ensure that the business was robust to interest rate shocks. And at the time, his risk people were looking at what happens if we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% shift. And his point was, well, what happens if we have a 10, 15% shift? Because that might be a small risk, but it's one of those fat tail risks that happens more often than you think. And when it happens, it's more disastrous. And what we have to make sure is that the boat doesn't sink when that happens. You talk there about the current rates of 4 to 4.5%. What are you sort of planning for as a business? Where is your sort of fat tail risk tolerance to make sure that your boat is not sinking?
Well, it's, again, different industry, different companies have different sets of risks to worry about. But if I take, the property world is essentially about your balance sheet. Property companies go bust when their balance sheets come under stress. So stress testing balance sheets is a sort of just the day job, and you look at extreme, you're saying 5 to 10% scenarios, and if you're in banking, you look at a whole series of default scenarios. And I think the point there is to push the thinking, because our natural tendency is to see what's in front of us and think that's it. And we don't see the edges of the screen. And that's the bit where the normally catastrophic risk comes. So scenario planning and working out, well, what would you do? To some extent, COVID gave a number of us a whole set of, oh, good, you're going to be a retailer and you can't open any shops. Or you're a landlord and none of your retailers are paying you any money. And it was existential stuff. So I think we've been taught in the last sort of 5-10 years that you have to gameplay extreme situations as opposed to just 10% up or down scenarios. And what you learn is that really where's the pressure point in your business model, and typically, the danger of real financial distress. Whereas if I think about the hospital group, going back to that, I'm much more influenced there by what's going on in other areas like what's happening with the NHS, for good or bad. How many people are coming into private insurance, private health insurance, because that creates the market, and how many people are frankly getting old and ill and want to self-pay. So I've got 3 completely different levels of risk and issue playing out. And there, I think the challenge is working out which ones actually really move the dial, because a lot of stuff can happen and actually you can find your way through it. But 1 or 2 of these things are pretty catastrophic.
And on interest rates specifically, because it feels like most businesses are either directly or indirectly exposed to those. With the property business, what does your sort of fat tail risk look like? Would you model for a world with 15% interest rates, or do you just think actually, that's really not realistic?
I find that, I remember paying a 15% mortgage in my extreme youth when I was probably your age, Oliver. The reality is, I think at the moment, a useful simulation is a 10%, because that is not impossible. It's not very likely, but that's more in the fat tail risk. And I think the harder bit, and this is the bit I do worry about rather than absolute rates, is if we see a significant liquidity problem, make GFC look sort of small beer. So if something goes wrong in private credit in the US, combined with crypto, and the market just seizes up and stops providing liquidity, it's that risk, which is sort of a GFC squared type event. I think that's another thing you've got to try and model and work out what you can do.
And what is the answer on that? Because it feels like there are a lot of people positioning themselves right now for that scenario. And is it just a question of making sure you've got rock solid access to liquidity, or is it more than that?
I think, step 1 is have you really got access to liquidity, but also what's your self-help opportunity? And in those situations, really understanding your cash flow. and if I take property, historically people were quite obsessed with valuation on numbers, and that creates a sort of sense of value. Actually, I much prefer cash return on cash as being the key, and actually when do you get paid? And so the 2 things you should be doing if you're thinking about this is, have you actually checked your refinancing dates? When's the liquidity event that you have to actually deal with? Because if you've got 5 years before you have to go anywhere near someone, it's probably unlikely that you're going to have an immediate crisis. If you're 1 year away from a refi, that's quite stressy, and you've got to think much harder about that, because you can't guarantee that people will be around at the point when you need them. And then I think you have the sort of disaster scenario saying, well, if it does go wrong, what could you sell, buy, merge with, do something much more radical that would make sense in a world where liquidity had evaporated? And I think creatively, just wargaming some of that is actually really helpful, and it reminds you that you are dealing with a business model that has got things it doesn't control and things it has to react to, and you need to understand what levers you can pull.
You've talked about crises in different forms. I'd love to talk a little bit about your experience on Debenhams as chair, where you accepted the role in 2016. What was your assessment of the business and the board going in?
Well, I think the reality of that was we knew it was going to be a restructure job, and also there was indication from shareholders they wanted a change of management team. So there was no illusions. I think the thing that I thought was the art of the possible turned out to not be deliverable was I could see a future for 35 to 50 stores maximum and a website, and things like Designers at Debenhams, great brands, the big share of the health and beauty market, which has now been carved up, particularly with the Boots taking advantage of that, and Next, and a real opportunity to get right sized because it was overexpanded and over indebted in terms of the lease liabilities. And the two things that I didn't see probably from the outside with the benefit of hindsight, one is ironically, the property dimension was so rigid that you couldn't invest in the bottom half of the stores. They weren't making enough money, but they weren't losing enough money, bizarrely. So you ended up, you didn't have enough of a crisis to call a CVA immediately, which I was sort of hoping I could. And I couldn't hand the keys back to the landlords because they said, well, someone else signed this lease. There you go. And we've, in the ironic net position now at Landsec, converted a former Debenhams down in Cardiff into a public park. And I tried to suggest that at the time when I was on the other side of the table, and I got told by the previous management to get lost. So we couldn't get the bottom 50 away. We weren't broken enough to have a CVA because actually there was enough cash flow in the business. And then the bonus prize was seeing Mike Ashley go from 3% to 30% of the shares and then start to ask to do things. And I kept saying to him, just buy the company. That would be great, but you can't run it as a 30% shareholder. And he then decided that he could, and that with one other shareholder put enough votes together to get over 50% of it. Technically, it was only 35% of the total shareholding, but that was at the AGM was enough to get me knocked off the board. And then after I left, then things happened with COVID and the whole thing got very different. But at the time, it was very clear it had to be restructured. But we then couldn't get there because of the property straitjacket and Mike, and it just got very frustrated. But I still look at it and think, I think we could have, we knew what we were doing and we gave it a good try. We, bumped into something which we couldn't fix. And then Mike was prepared to play the game he wanted to play. And then sometimes you have to just say, look, I've told you no, I'm not going to change my mind. And if you don't like me, absolutely, you can vote me off. And he duly did.
So you issued that very public ultimatum of, make a takeover offer or step back. As you sort of reflect on that, is there anything you would have done differently to what you did with the benefit of hindsight?
I think the benefit of hindsight sort of test is probably about, could we have done a more radical restructure sooner? Because I think as ever, if you got ahead of it and you could have broken the business up differently, I think we could have taken a more of an axe to it. But we were caught in that dangerous sort of boiling frog territory where you're actually still making nearly 90, 100 million pounds of profit. You can't declare a bankrupt emergency because you just haven't got the evidence of it. And he couldn't get the main problem of the leases resolved except through a CVA. So we were waiting to do the CVA and waiting to drop things out. And it just, I think maybe, benefit, you could say we should have pushed maybe against some of our legal advice sooner and tried to get something more radical more quickly because it was clear it had to change.
Always a uncomfortable position to be in when you're pushing against legal advice as a board member, and obviously easy to say with hindsight. But if you could somehow go back in time and be offering yourself counsel in that moment, what could you have said to yourself that would have given you the courage to do that?
I think it was probably a case of saying, is there another legal restructuring option that we haven't thought of? Because we were stuck in, coming in thinking we're going to do a CVA, we're going to restructure, it'll get down to, you sort of think, okay, that's going to be the answer. And then when you find you can't get to a CVA for another 2 years because of the way the numbers are working, we should have, I think, said to ourselves, right, is there a radical spin-off plan or something else that we could do that it would be better than just wait and get to that? And we sort of incrementally got ourselves to somewhere, whereas I'm not sure there was actually still a radical answer, but we probably should have spent more time on that.
So that sounds like the sort of Chip, Dan Heath, better decision-making framework of create more options, spend more time creating more options. My guess is you had a bright group of people thinking hard about it at the time. Like what reality could you have done differently? Because again, it's easy to say try harder, but I always think one of the lessons I've had from my engineers is, try harder doesn't work. You need to make systemic change. So what could a board member listening to this say, okay, I hear you, Sir Ian, we need to create more options in those difficult situations, but what systematically could we do and change in the way we operate to enable that?
Well, I think the very heart of that particular situation was 35-year long leases at uneconomic rents. And that was the problem. Now, the CVA was considered the only legal option of doing it. The question to my mind is, if you'd have inherited that situation, what else could you have done earlier? And with certainly UK law, it's very hard to get out of a lease. If we'd been in France, it would have been very easy to hand the keys back and just go, great, I can restructure this in 6 months. But, if there was another way of transferring value to a different vehicle, getting the website out into a separate place, splitting it off, doing something, and that's what I was thinking about doing, to create effectively an e-commerce business that could be demerged away from the leases, because it was the leases that were the sort of prison walls, as it were, of the business. And if we could have put brands and website out and split the business, there was a chance to do that. But really quite complicated to do that, particularly with question of IP and who owns what. So we sort of beat our head against the wall and said, well, actually, no, it's the CVA.
So for a board member listening to this who finds themselves in that situation, managing major shareholder activism, particularly if the organization is under operational stress, and they come to you and say, Sir Ian, what advice can you offer me right now that you've taken from your experience? What would you say to them?
Well, first up, if you've got a sort of serious activist, and we've got large shareholders in a couple of places I've been dealing with, your first requirement is, particularly for the chairman, to be spending time with those people. I'm again concerned that one of the jobs for the chairman in those situations is to provide air cover for the exec, and the exec needs to be focused on running the business. If there is a particularly activist shareholder, actually the chairman's got to be a point person for that. So step one is step into that space and make sure the board is briefed on what's going on, what does an activist want differently from what maybe the board want to do, and then a process for agreeing how that will be taken forward or not. And sometimes, depending on the nature of the activist, the answer is, I've heard you, that's great, but I'm not going to agree, which is the sort of where I ended up with Mike Ashley, because he wanted to run the business at 30%. In that sense, quite easy to say, no, we can't. As legally, our director of shares can't do it. If it's we'd like you to change strategy on this bit, we say, well, let's have a look at it, let's have the debate. And at that point, you can decide rationally as a board what you want to do. But I think the key thing is engagement, protect the management, and then be very considered about what you do and don't do. And above all else, do not panic or flap. The danger here is, particularly if you've got first-time Neds in the room and they're reading stuff in the press and going, oh my God, hair on fire and panic, what are we going to do? That is really unhelpful. Because people then start saying, we've got to do something, we've got to do this, we've got to do that. And often the answer is nope, we're just going to think this through very carefully and calmly, and we will decide it in due course. We do not have to knee-jerk or respond or put out a statement or do something unnecessary.
So protect the management and slow down. Don't get rushed into a decision.
Don't get rushed
by external factors. Before we wrap up with the lightning round, I just want to talk briefly about your broader non-executive experience, because not only have you had extensive commercial experience, you've also had extensive experience with government board roles. Really interested for someone who has perhaps come from a commercial background, who's listening to this as a board member and is thinking about, do I take on government board roles? They look like a nightmare. They look fairly thankless, clearly not remunerated in the same way. Really interested to hear your reflections on that, what advice you would share with them?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that there is an opportunity for people from the business and commercial world to contribute in other areas. And that could be government, it could be arm's length bodies, it can be charities, it can be other institutions. And, that's not for everyone. Some people aren't interested, but I certainly found that I've been interested in government, not politics, and also chair the Institute for Government, the think tank. And that's been fascinating, trying to come up with improving ways of making government more effective. And I've personally found the experience of being at DWP and then being the lead non-exec for the government, A, fascinating from a sort of selfish point of view, but B, I think we were able to add value in some places where the challenge was much more business-esque in the sense of you're transforming departments, you're putting in new systems, you're delivering programs of change. And actually, there's a lot of overlap from the experience in the business world to do that. Now, you have to also recognize it's different and it's much more complicated than the business world, because in the business world, if your customers are happy, colleagues are happy, and you've got a P&L, you're sort of done. In the political and institutional world, there's often very huge variations of grey. When you ask the question, what does good look like? You get quite a complicated sort of long answer. Someone told me at DWP that I said, what's the point of it? What does success look like? He said, well, we get people back into work. I said, well, I think the labour market probably does that. What do you do that is different, that actually is the value add? And it's much harder. And also there's archaeology of previous government initiatives. So they're just things that are, when you ask, why are we doing this? You get the sort of, well, we're doing it. So the idea of bringing some zero-based budgeting to government, I think, would be helpful. But the idea of having strategy in government would be particularly helpful. And then you can plan and do it. So I think there are things that business people can do and help with. But you have to be interested. You also have to be prepared to accept it's not coming from the business world and telling people what to do. It is about helping in partnership terms, but it's generally fascinating stuff. And having, for example, shared Channel 4, which was a really interesting insight into how that public service broadcasting works, you will learn a lot from it. And I think you can contribute a lot, particularly in the boardroom level, by being experienced NED or experienced chair, as you go through what typically are the same set of questions. What's the strategy? Have we got the right people here? How are we measuring performance? And then where are we allocating capital? It's still true for all these areas. And personally, I've always been interested in the sort of some notion of public service. And I've been doing this and some other charity things because I feel like if we've been lucky enough to be successful in other areas, we ought to be contributing.
And for that person listening to you there saying, okay, so you've inspired me, I will give this a go. What are the mistakes that you've made in that journey that you might be able to help them shortcut and learn from?
Yeah, it's probably two main mistakes that, with the benefit of hindsight, I would say, is that not all opportunities are the same. There's a wildly different opportunity for impact in certain areas with certain types of organizations. So you're discussing a small arm's length body or a charity or something. You've got to look really carefully at the dynamics of that situation, which is particularly who's the leadership and is it stable? And then do you understand what the economics and the business model or the funding model is? For example, if you go on the board of one of the departments in the government which is getting more money, like defence, that's good timing, right place, right time, good people. If you go to the wrong place which is being cut and it's going miserable and it's no longer on the government's priorities, don't do it. So pick your spot. And then secondly, there's a big need to get to know how different that landscape is and not just simply cut and paste some of your business approaches into that. So spending time on how the culture works, how decision making works, because it's very different. And I think having the persistence to affect change, but it won't be in the way that if you've been CEO, you're used to being able to make change much more quickly.
Do you feel, as you sort of reflect back, that you have been a better exec or non-exec?
That's totally different. And I think the big issue is for a lot of people, the transition from exec to non-exec is really quite tricky. And there are lots of examples of people who cannot quite get the CEO muscle out. They're just still pretending to be CEOs. I've definitely felt I made the transition, and a part of that was feeling guilty in my first phase of portfolio. When as CEO, you're 24/7 thinking about everything the whole time. Tape in your head never stops. And you are constantly worrying about this thing. As non-exec, you have to learn to sort of leave the boardroom, drop the mic, and go on to something else. And as a matter of sort of responsibility and being conscientious, that felt very uncomfortable to me in my early starting phases of being a portfolio Ned. But then I think I've figured out that it's actually an opportunity, because what you've got is a limited amount of time to offer as a non-exec. And actually that's the lens which you have to use to say, how do I add the most value I can in the limited period of time I've got? So the last thing I want to do is be wasting it on meaningless corporate governance guff. I want to be talking about the really big issues, the strategy, the people, the key decisions. And actually, once you get your head around that, you say, right, I've got a tremendous lens to add value. It gives you a way of working out where to spend your time, because you could spend 7 days a week on all the non-exec stuff I do, but that's pointless. And actually, a non-exec who's around 7 days a week is a positive liability, should not be let anywhere near the management team. So I would, focusing your effort is the biggest difference. And I think I've got a lot better at that than I was when I started out as a non-exec.
Christian Unger in episode 123, who's a private equity, controls the Partners Group private equity non-exec portfolio, observed one of the two characteristics that they observed in the highest performing organizations was the amount of time their non-execs spent on it, that it was directly correlated to performance, which I guess runs a little bit against the grain of what you're saying there around actually you want the non-execs spending less time. How do you think about that tension? Do you think the private equity model goes too far?
No, I think PE has a different model for non-execs, and it is less governance, obviously is one, but more time, more in the way of a sort of operating partner type mentality. And there are horses for courses, so whichever works. I think for the listed companies, you've got quite a clear role instead of responsibilities. And I think finding the right balance there in terms of time spent, you clearly have to spend time to get to know the business, get to know the people, spend time in it, be visible in it as well, which I think is an important point for all boards. But I would say you have to figure out where your contribution starts and stops. And having seen in some cases boards trying to run businesses directly, that typically is a route to disaster. So I think the non-exec model, once it's established and the relationships are there, I think is actually a pretty decent model. And you can add a lot of value as a Ned in it. So I don't think you have to be there 5 days a week.
So Ian, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a brief response if you're ready.
Okay, let's see if I can do this one.
Best advice for someone beginning their boardroom journey?
Listen very carefully for the first 3 to 6 months, but then make sure you're contributing once you're in place.
Best book every board member should read and why?
Best book I would suggest for Neds, and this is not a business book, but it's for people in this stage, particularly if they've been execs, is a book by Arthur C. Brooks called From Strength to Strength, which is about how you navigate your second career or second or third career. Very, very thoughtful book.
Most valuable board ritual?
Non-exec closed sessions.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
Grandstanding politics.
What's a boardroom myth you think needs busting?
The myth is that everyone has to agree to all the decisions. We back decisions once they're taken, but if you don't have debate, you've got to have people disagreeing.
Favourite quote?
It's easy to confuse activity with achievement. Don't.
Your most significant professional insight?
The importance of really understanding your customers and ideally with as much data as you can, but really, really understanding your customers, what they're actually doing, as opposed to what people tell you they're doing.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
I was actually in the middle of the bid and I had a very nervous general counsel who told me to do something because otherwise we're all going to jail. And I looked at the person and said, right, mental note, fire this person, which we did. And it was just a complete panic and the ability to turn around and say, no, we're not. That is advice. We're not going to take it.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I came onto boards as a divisional CEO, firstly Sears and then at Kingfisher when I ran e-commerce. And actually at one point we had 3 or 4 operating execs on it. And I used to think that was a good model because you saw more of the business, but it made for a very big board. and B, it created some sort of odd politics for the rest of the organisation. So I think smaller boards with CEO and CFO, I think, are absolutely best. And that, having seen some very big, unwieldy boards, I think that they just become dysfunctional. So I'm probably now a smaller board advocate.
What's your upper limit?
Personally, I don't really think it works beyond 9.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
Thinking that Mike Ashley wouldn't vote against me at Debenhams because we thought we were trying to deal with it, and he is just unpredictable. And so from that, what I learned was you can't predict what some of your shareholders are going to do, and you have to have, be resilient and just get on with what you think the right thing to do is.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I think I am much more interested now as how the board as a team works and how the chair has to be responsible for that team performing. And it's not just the exec team who you have to perform, it's very much the board, and much more interested in the interplay between the various board members. So we've done a set of profiling exercises here at Landsec to explain the thinking styles to each other so that we actually work better as a team because we understand each other better. And that whole interplay, that dynamic of team, board as team is to my mind, the really critical bit.
Which thinking styles exercise did you do?
This is strengths. I can't remember which is because it was used by the exec team here as well. A guy called Andrew Dykoff's on it, and it is quite fascinating when you see this. I mean, there are some similarities. If you're going to be in a FTSE board, you're probably quite good at strategy, and you've probably done a few things. But it was quite interesting, the thinking styles and people being more or less introvert, some happy with data, others being sort of quite outgoing and loud, and how you get that group to work together. And that's always the thing I enjoyed most about business was teams, and the same is true for boards.
And how has it changed how you operate besides a better understanding of one another?
It's essentially an understanding of how we would discuss and work on things together. And I'm probably using people differently as a result now around the board table to sort of go after certain things, and also encourage people to ask the questions in their way and people from the other side to understand it.
Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
I think the first most important one for me is the importance of focusing boards' time and attention on the top 5 things that matter. The 80-20 rule, however you want to express it. But you've got to be absolutely ruthless about saying, are we spending the right amount of time on the right things? And then, being disciplined about it. And related to that would be tracking decisions and actually logging decisions and following up and having a clear line of sight from what you discussed so that you hold management to account for the decisions that we collectively made. And the final bit is the third recommendation is make sure you're having debates in that time. Most boards I've seen fail through groupthink, and you have to agree at the end and you have to back decisions. But if you don't debate, if you don't have different points of view around the table, something's going wrong.
And just to help people calibrate what those top 5 things look like, could you give us an example from a board?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in most boards, you're going to have, very briefly, 3 main headings, one of which is the strategic framework. Is that clear? Second is the skills, and that goes to at least Exco -1. Have you got really good skills matrix? Have you got the right team that can deliver that strategy? Third area is really good KPIs and metrics, just good, solid information systems. And then the fourth bit, it will be inflection points, decisions, which are typically about capital allocation. So are we buying something, selling something, shifting money from one thing to another? And most of what you need to do is then the rest of it is monitoring what's the external environment's doing. So what's changing, how things are moving, including the technology questions. And if you get those sort of 4 or 5 things clear, you're in the right place. And I wouldn't worry so much about the REMCO terms of reference. I'm quite able to delegate that.
So Ian, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thank you.